I'm Andrew Joseph Keith, and this is the Figure Sculpting Fundamentals course. In this video, we're finally going to put some meat on those bones. I'm talking about adding clay to our wire armatures. In this lesson, we will be taking our sculpture from a naked armature to a sculpture that has all of the gesture, balance, proportion, and primary masses of the figure established. If there's one thing that I hope that you understand from this course and from this lesson, it's to focus first on the primary forms, then check those forms for accuracy, then move on to the secondary forms, check those for accuracy, and then finally move on to the tertiary forms or surface detail. When I first began sculpting, I developed a bad habit of adding too much clay too quickly. I figured that I could hurry the process along by adding more than enough mass to the figure and then using tools to scrape away the excess. Think of it like beginning a drawing with lines that are thick and solid instead of light lines for the underdrawing. Those first lines may need to be adjusted, which becomes more difficult if you fully commit to them right from the start. In the same way, if you add too much clay too fast, you don't have the underlying structures that give you the chance to make those small adjustments here and there as you build out the forms. When I was more worried about getting all the mass onto the sculpture as quick as possible, I wasn't as careful with my placement of each piece of clay. It is much more effective to obtain those subtle forms by adding small bits of clay than by scraping away the clay with tools. Scraping away at the surface of the clay has a tendency to make the sculpture feel stiff instead of supple and lifelike. As I learned more about sculpting, I realized most master sculptors tend to sculpt very thin in the beginning, adding clay one piece at a time to build out the forms. Sculpting thin encourages us to be more careful as we choose which areas need more clay. It's referred to as additive sculpture for a reason. Add small bits of clay thoughtfully, here and there, to build out the forms. For this, I will be using an 18-inch wire armature on my homemade armature stand. If you have any questions on the materials, the tools, or capturing the gesture, go back and watch the videos on those topics. I'll be sculpting this pose with the references provided by posespace.com. Before starting, I like to warm up the Chavant Medium NSP clay so that it's soft and malleable. I usually do this by placing it in the oven at about 150 degrees Fahrenheit, or you can place the clay under a heat lamp or use a heat gun, which is basically a heavy-duty blow dryer, from a few feet back so it doesn't get too hot. Or you could put the clay in a Ziploc bag and then place the bag in some hot water. To begin adding clay, I like to add just enough clay to cover the wire armature so no wire is exposed. I start by covering the feet to stabilize them to the baseboard with clay. Then I'll continue to the rest of the figure. We'll want to use our hands as much as possible to add clay and build the forms. Our hands will be the quickest, most efficient way for shaping the clay. I'll make a coil by pinching off a small piece of clay and then rolling it between my thumb and forefinger. Once the armature is hidden under a thin layer of clay, we can then start to build out the larger masses, starting with the primary forms of the head, the rib cage, and pelvis. These will help us locate important landmarks of the body. These masses will also help us see whether or not we have captured the gesture correctly. These primary forms are complicated, so we'll talk about how to sculpt the Loomis head, the egg of the rib cage, and the box of the pelvis in future lessons. They don't have to be perfect, but they should be close to symmetrical, close to the right height, and thin in their width, from side to side and front to back. Always err on the side of making these primary forms thin, because most of this will still be covered with more clay as we continue to build out the figure. Drawing a clear center line will help us maintain the symmetry and gesture. When drawing the center line, keep the line straight as it passes through the rib cage and pelvis. We don't want a squiggly center line. Draw in other guidelines, like the angle of the shoulders, the angle of the bottom of the rib cage, the angle of the aces points of the pelvis, and the triangle of the sacrum. It's important to be consistent as well, and not build out one area of the sculpture too quickly. There shouldn't be any one area that looks way more developed than the rest of the sculpture. There will be a temptation to work in one area or to avoid difficult areas until the end. But you must fight it. Fight that urge. Resist the urge to focus on one area at the expense of the whole. The progression to the right amount of mass should be a slow, deliberate process so that the whole figure accumulates clay steadily and uniformly. Because these primary forms have more mass in them, we can build them out using larger bits of clay. For larger sculptures, I will often build an outline of the head or rib cage from the side view, built out from the center line, then turn the sculpture 90 degrees and do the same from the front view, making a kind of X with the silhouette of the front and side views. Then I can use those as reference points and fill up the rest of the form with clay. Once the primary masses of the head, the rib cage, and the pelvis are established, take a step back and check the gesture again from every angle. It's normal for things to shift slightly as you're adding clay, so get into the habit of constantly checking the gesture and angles to make sure that you're not losing the pose. We can hold the sculpture up directly to the model if we're sculpting from life, or we could hold it up to a reference image on a large screen to check it from each angle. We can also take an image of the sculpture, lower the opacity, and then overlay it on a reference image of the model, though it can be tricky to take the image from the same position as the model photo. These tricks will help you see what areas are off and help you fix them early on. If there are changes that need to be made, remember that the earlier on we make those changes, the less work we'll have to redo later on in the process. Here's a good rule: if you see something's wrong, stop and fix it right away. Double check with your reference to make sure that what you're going to fix is the right solution for the problem. For example, you might be sculpting a nose that looks too big, but the real problem may be that the head itself is too small. This is why it's important to work evenly and not get too focused in on one area at the expense of the whole. Now that we have the head, the rib cage, and the pelvis in place, we can start to fill the safe areas. These are areas like the space between the bottom of the rib cage and the top of the pelvis that will obviously need to be filled at some point. We can start to add more thickness in the limbs while still keeping the figure thin. We're trying to capture those primary forms. Edward Lanteri shows this stage in his book Modeling and Sculpting the Human Figure. Here you can see this skinny version of the figure where he accurately captures the proportions, the gesture, the primary forms, and hints at some of the secondary forms of the figure. As we compare our sculpture to our references, it is important to focus more on the outline or the silhouette than on the surface detail inside the outline, sometimes referred to as the internal information. Capturing the outline from one angle and then turning the sculpture to a new angle and repeating the process is a much more accurate way to sculpt. Pay attention to the negative space that surrounds the figure. The shapes of these negative areas will help us double check if our silhouette is developed correctly. We tend to be less biased when we focus on the negative space. It becomes a simple, abstract shape that we try to replicate. It's much easier to capture the outline than the hills and valleys of the internal information. Plus, remember that the silhouette from one angle will be the internal information from another angle. So we first establish a skinny version of the head, the rib cage, and the pelvis, then fill in some of the safe areas, then draw in the center line and guidelines, and now we have a sure foundation on which we can build the contours of the silhouette. As we're building the contours, try to imagine how these forms wrap around the body. The outline that we see from the silhouette is not like a cardboard cutout that is flat from the side view. The contours of the silhouette move forward and back in space. For example, if we're looking at the silhouette of the figure from the front view, the widest point on the pelvis is closer to the front plane of the figure, whereas the widest point on the upper part of the chest will be closer to the back plane. Keep this in mind as you build the silhouette. Try to lay the coils of clay in the directions of the forms as they bend around the figure. At this stage, don't get too obsessed about the subtle bumps and dips of the contours. Instead, try to focus on the general gesture of the outline of the figure. Again, look at this thin version of this sculpture by Edward Lanteri. At this stage, he's not developing the details. Once he's confident that the figure has captured the gesture, proportions, and primary forms, then he'll move on to the details and anatomy, the secondary forms. As long as we're sculpting thin, there will be plenty of space to add those bumps and details once we're confident in the primary forms. Try not to let your sculpture become too precious at any stage. Often, I will start adding details and then realize that I still need to make some large adjustments. So I'll take a knife or loop tool to the sculpture, or I'll pull the feet up from the ground and change the stance. Being unwilling to make those big changes when something in the sculpture isn't working can keep the sculpture from becoming the best it can be, and it can keep you from learning a new lesson. After we have this skinny, simplified version of the figure, we can then move on and start to focus on the secondary forms. And we'll talk about that part of the lesson in the premium course, where we'll talk about things like how to build out the muscles and flesh out from the center line so that there is the same amount of mass on either side of the figure, how to find mistakes by changing your perspective. Your assignment is to sculpt the figure and develop it to this stage: a thin figure with all of the primary forms in place and hints at some of the secondary forms, as well as having a center line and other guidelines to indicate important landmarks. You can do this assignment any size that you like, but I recommend somewhere between 10 and 18 inches tall. If it's too large, it will take a lot of time and use up a lot of clay, and if it's too small, it will be hard to work on those details. You can take your own references by following the steps in the previous lesson on taking references for sculpture. The premium lessons are what help us to create more of these free videos. There are lessons like the second half of this lesson that are available only to premium members. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in part 2 of this lesson. If not, then I'll see you in the next free lesson on sculpting the Loomis head. Till next time.